Imagine standing in a room full of people you trust, friends, family, even your own husband, only to realize that everyone knows a secret except you. The man you've built your life with has been hiding something, and tonight, in front of everyone, the truth is about to explode. This is a story of betrayal, deception, and a woman who refused to stay in the dark. Stay with us as we reveal the shocking twists that changed everything. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story that will make you question everything. It was the kind of marriage everyone admired. Emma and David had been together for nearly 20 years. They had 2 children, a beautiful home, and a life that looked perfect from the outside. Emma often found herself smiling as she looked at the family pictures hanging on the walls of their cozy living room. The photos showed a happy couple, surrounded by children and family, and they had always been the picture of devotion. At family gatherings, everyone admired David's charm and Emma's warmth. They had a bond that seemed unbreakable, or so Emma thought. But as many of us know, sometimes the perfect facade can hide the darkest truths. Emma had never suspected anything. She trusted David completely, as many wives do with their husbands. He was her rock, the one she turned to in times of joy and sorrow. Little did she know, David was hiding a secret that would soon come crashing down on their family. It all started innocently enough, or at least that's how it seemed. One weekend, the family decided to host a reunion at their home. It was a yearly tradition, and Emma had been looking forward to it for months. She spent days preparing, cooking, cleaning, making sure everything was just right. David, as usual, was the one handling the more mundane things, like greeting guests and setting up the yard. But during this particular reunion, Emma noticed something strange. David seemed distracted, more so than usual. He kept disappearing, slipping away from the crowd for long stretches of time. Whenever Emma asked where he was, he'd brush it off with a quick excuse. Just checking on the barbecue, or I'll be right back. Gotta handle something. Emma didn't think much of it at first. After all, they were busy with family, and sometimes people needed a break. But there was something in his tone, something in the way he avoided her gaze, that made her wonder. What was he hiding? Was there something more to his quick exits than he was letting on? Emma pushed the thought to the back of her mind, not wanting to overthink it. But as the night went on, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. The evening passed and everyone enjoyed the reunion, but Emma couldn't ignore the strange feeling that lingered. Later that night, when the last of the guests had left, Emma went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. She kept thinking about David's odd behavior, about the way he had acted around Rachel, their nanny. Rachel had worked for them for a year now, and though she was kind and professional, there was something in the way she smiled at David that made Emma uneasy. What was going on? Had her perfect life been nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion? What would happen if she was right? Was her husband, the man she had trusted for so long, leading a double life? The following morning, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. It was a quiet morning, the kind where you think you'll have time to reflect, to sort things out. But instead, her mind was racing. She had always prided herself on her intuition, and right now her gut was telling her that she was missing something. She could feel it deep down in her bones, a cold whisper in the back of her mind that wouldn't go away. The more she thought about it, the more her suspicions grew. It wasn't just David's behavior the night of the reunion. It was the little things she had brushed off over the past few months. The unexplained phone calls that David always seemed to take in private, the messages that he quickly deleted, the way he'd become more distant when she tried to engage him in conversation. Emma wasn't a detective. She wasn't trying to find trouble, but the pieces were starting to fit together in a way that made her uncomfortable. One morning, as she was sorting through the laundry, she stumbled upon something unexpected. A receipt from a hotel, one she had never seen before. It was dated just a few weeks ago. She stared at it for a long time, turning it over in her hands. The hotel wasn't in the city, but a few hours away. Why hadn't David mentioned he was going there? What business did he have at a hotel so far from home? And why hadn't he told her about it? As she thought about it, she realized that David's excuses had become more frequent lately. He'd been working late more often, or going on business trips that seemed to stretch longer than necessary. Had he been going to this hotel during those times? Emma felt a knot in her stomach. She wasn't sure if she wanted to find out the truth, but she knew she had to. She had to trust her instincts, even if they were taking her down a path she didn't want to go. The next time David left for work, Emma decided to take a closer look at his phone. She knew it was a breach of trust, but her heart was pounding as she tapped in his password, one she had never had to ask for before. She told herself she was just looking for clues, not for a reason to confront him. But as soon as the screen lit up, her breath caught in her throat. There, in plain sight, were several text messages that sent a chill through her body. They weren't just casual messages. They were intimate, messages filled with longing, sweet nothings and promises. It didn't take long for Emma to realize that these messages weren't for her. They were for Rachel, their nanny. Her heart sank. She could feel the weight of the betrayal crushing her chest. Emma stared at the screen, her hands trembling. The words on the screen blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. David had been seeing Rachel behind her back. He had been lying to her for months. All the little signs she had ignored, all the things she had brushed off, were now glaring at her, undeniable and painful. What had Emma missed? How could she not have seen this? The woman who had cared for their children, the one Emma had trusted, had been part of a secret life with her husband. It was almost too much to process, yet the truth was staring her in the face. As Emma sat there in stunned silence, a question echoed in her mind. What was she going to do now? How could she confront David? Could she even trust him again? And just as quickly as her world had shattered, another thought crossed her mind. What if Rachel wasn't the only one involved in this betrayal? What if there was more to the story than she even realized? Emma's hands shook as she placed David's phone down on the kitchen counter. The world around her felt like it was spinning, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. The messages she had seen, intimate, loving, promises of secret meetings, were all she needed to know. The truth had been laid out before her, stark and painful. But as the shock began to settle in, a different emotion started to rise. Anger. How could he do this to her? How could he betray her trust like this, with someone so close to their family? The more she thought about it, the more she could feel the weight of his lies. It wasn't just the affair. It was everything. The quiet betrayals, the lies, the secrets. Emma had always believed in their marriage, in the vows they had made. But now those vows seemed hollow, nothing more than words spoken without meaning. She knew she had to confront him. She couldn't let this go, not when it had gone so far. But the thought of doing it was overwhelming. Would she be able to keep her composure? Would he try to deny it? What if he tried to spin it into something else? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but one thing was certain. She couldn't let this continue. That evening when David came home from work, Emma had a plan. She would ask him about it, gently at first, to see how he reacted. If he tried to deny it, she would confront him with everything. She didn't know if she was ready for what might happen next, but she knew she couldn't pretend anymore. As David walked through the door, Emma took a deep breath. He seemed in his usual cheerful mood, his briefcase in hand, ready to jump into his routine. But Emma wasn't in the mood for small talk. She was ready for something far more serious. "David," she began, her voice steady but with a tightness that he immediately picked up on. He turned to her, a smile on his lips, but it faltered as he noticed the look in her eyes. It wasn't the usual warmth he was used to. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice full of concern. But Emma could see through the facade. He wasn't concerned for her, he was concerned for himself. "I think we need to talk," she replied, her voice low, almost too calm. That was the moment the tension started to settle between them. David's smile faded completely. He set his briefcase down, his eyes darting nervously as if he knew what was coming. "About what?" he asked, though the question was more of a reflex. Emma could see the discomfort in his face, the way his eyes avoided hers. "About Rachel," Emma said, her voice breaking slightly as she said the name. David stiffened, his expression instantly shifting from nervous to defensive. "What about Rachel?" he asked quickly, a little too quickly. Emma could feel her heart race in her chest. This was the moment. "I know about the messages, David. I know about the hotel," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the words. She wasn't shouting, wasn't crying, but her words were a quiet, undeniable accusation that hung in the air like a storm cloud. For a long moment, David didn't say anything. He just stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, as if searching for the right words. But there were no right words. The truth was already out there, in the air between them. And yet David still tried to defend himself. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice shaky now, but still trying to sound calm. "It's complicated, Emma." "Complicated?" Emma echoed, her voice rising for the first time. "How is it complicated? You've been having an affair with Rachel behind my back. That's not complicated, David. That's betrayal. That's dishonesty. And it's the one thing I can't forgive." David's face twisted in confusion, frustration, and fear. He tried to grab her hand, but Emma pulled away. She couldn't bear to be touched by him right now. "Please, Emma," he begged, his voice cracking. "It was a mistake. I never meant for you to find out this way." "How else was I supposed to find out?" she shot back, her anger flaring. "You've lied to me for months. For months, David. You think I didn't notice? You think I didn't see the way you avoided me? The way you acted around Rachel?" David fell silent, his face a mixture of guilt and defiance. He knew she was right. He had been caught. But what he didn't know was that Emma wasn't just hurt by the affair. She was hurt by the lies, by the way he had looked her in the eye every day and pretended everything was fine when he was hiding something so deeply wrong. For a brief moment, David opened his mouth to say something else, but Emma cut him off, her voice clear and resolute. "I don't want to hear it. You've already told me everything I need to know." David looked at her for a long moment, as if searching for any sign of hope. But Emma wasn't about to back down. This wasn't just about Rachel or the affair anymore. It was about her self-respect, her dignity, and the realization that sometimes the hardest thing to do is to walk away from someone you once trusted completely. And so Emma stood there, her heart heavy with the pain of betrayal, but her resolve stronger than it had ever been before. What would she do next? How would this all end? Those questions loomed large, but for now, all she could do was face the truth and begin to figure out how to move forward. The silence between them hung in the air, thick with the weight of their broken trust. David stood there, his shoulders slumped as if the energy had been drained from him. Emma, on the other hand, felt a strange mix of emptiness and clarity. It was as though the veil had been lifted from her eyes, and for the first time, she could see everything clearly. The lies, the betrayal, the secrets. She had always believed in the strength of her marriage, in the idea that love was enough to hold them together. But now that belief felt like a distant memory. What had happened to the man she had married? Where was the David who had promised to cherish her, to stand by her no matter what? And how had Rachel, someone she had trusted, become part of this deception? As the evening wore on, the reality of the situation began to sink in. David remained silent, too ashamed to speak, too broken to defend himself. Emma wasn't sure if he even had the words left to apologize. The damage had been done. The trust between them was shattered, and no apology could fix that. But what did she want? What did she hope for in this moment? Revenge? Closure? Or perhaps just answers? She didn't know if she could ever trust him again. The idea of continuing their life together felt unbearable. How could she share a bed with him, knowing what he had done? How could she look into his eyes and believe anything he said? And yet, there was a part of her that was still clinging to the hope that maybe, just maybe, David wasn't entirely lost. Could he change? Could he make amends for the hurt he had caused? Or was this the final blow? The moment when everything they had built together came crumbling down. The more Emma thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about David's betrayal. It was about her own strength. She realized that she had allowed herself to be blinded by love for too long, and now it was time for her to regain control of her life. It wasn't about what David wanted anymore. It was about what she needed. David's voice broke through her thoughts. "Emma, I know I've messed up. I don't know how to fix this, but I'll do whatever it takes." His words were desperate, pleading, but Emma wasn't sure if she could believe them anymore. The sincerity she once saw in his eyes had been replaced by something darker: fear, guilt, shame. "I don't know if you can fix this, David," Emma replied softly, her voice steady but filled with pain. "I don't even know if I can fix this." David looked at her with pleading eyes, but Emma could barely stand to look at him. The man she thought she knew had turned into a stranger who had betrayed her trust, her love, and her family. And then, as if on cue, the doorbell rang. Emma froze, startled by the interruption. It was too soon for any of their children to be home. Who could it be? David, still trying to regain his composure, wiped his face and turned toward the door. "I'll get it," he mumbled, but Emma shook her head. "No, I'll handle it," she said quietly. Emma stood up, her legs shaky but determined, and walked toward the door. As she opened it, her heart skipped a beat. Standing there was Rachel, the nanny. She looked just as surprised to see Emma as Emma was to see her. There was something in Rachel's eyes, something that spoke of guilt and fear, but also an unsettling calm. It was as though Rachel had known this moment was coming. Before Emma could say a word, Rachel spoke first. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice quiet but urgent. "I never wanted to hurt you, Emma. But I need to explain." Emma's mind raced. How much more was there to this story? How much had she missed? Rachel's presence only added to the chaos in Emma's mind. She had come here, of all places, at this moment, to do what? To apologize? To justify her actions? Or was she here to make things even worse? "Explain," Emma repeated, her voice cold. "What could you possibly explain? You've been lying to me, hiding this affair for months. What's left to explain, Rachel?" Rachel took a step forward, her eyes filled with regret. "I know, and I'm sorry for everything. But you have to understand, it wasn't just me. David was the one who kept asking for more, kept pushing me to keep it a secret. He's the one who told me to stay quiet, to hide what was happening. He's the one who lied, not me." Emma's world tilted again. What was Rachel saying? Was she trying to shift the blame to David? Or was there more to this than she knew? Emma felt a knot twist in her stomach as the pieces started to come together. Rachel continued, her voice shaking. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I never wanted to be the reason a family fell apart. But David, he said you wouldn't understand. He said you'd never find out." Emma stood there, speechless for a moment, trying to process everything Rachel was saying. Could Rachel have been manipulated too? Had she really been just as much a victim as Emma? Or was she trying to cover her tracks, to shift the blame away from herself? The room was heavy with tension as Rachel took another step closer. "I'm so sorry, Emma. I never meant for things to go this far. But I need to tell you something. Something you don't know yet." Emma's heart raced. What more was there? What could Rachel possibly have to say that would make sense of this nightmare? Emma stood frozen, unable to fully process Rachel's words. For a moment it felt as though the ground beneath her was shifting, tilting, and she wasn't sure which way to turn. Rachel's apology didn't feel like it was coming from a place of genuine remorse. Instead, it felt calculated, as though she were trying to manipulate the situation in her favor, to make herself the victim in this tangled web of lies. Rachel stepped closer again, her voice growing more insistent. "There's more, Emma. There's something you don't know. David's been hiding more than just his affair with me. He's been involved with someone else, someone you know, someone close to you." Emma's mind raced, trying to make sense of Rachel's words. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. Rachel hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure whether she should go any further. But then, with a deep breath, she dropped the bombshell. "It's your sister, Laura. David's been seeing her too. For months. She's been involved in this, just like me." The words hit Emma like a punch to the gut. Her sister, the one person she had always trusted more than anyone. How could Laura, her own flesh and blood, be involved in this betrayal? The feeling of shock and betrayal surged through her body like a tidal wave, drowning her in its intensity. Emma's vision blurred as she tried to process the enormity of what Rachel had just revealed. Her sister, the woman who had always been there for her, the one person Emma had never suspected, had been part of this lie. How could Laura do this to her? How could she be involved with David, the man who had promised to love Emma for better or worse? The anger surged, but it was accompanied by a deep, painful ache in her chest. David had been hiding more than just his affair with Rachel. He had been betraying her with the one person she should have been able to trust above all else: her family, her sister. The thought felt like a betrayal on a level she couldn't even begin to understand. Rachel, sensing the shift in Emma's demeanor, tried to reach out, but Emma stepped back, her voice trembling with fury. "You're telling me this now? After everything?" After what you and David have done, you think you can just come here and drop more bombs on me? Like it's nothing?" Rachel lowered her head, her eyes filled with regret. "I know it's a lot, and I know it doesn't make it right. But you need to know. You deserve to know the whole truth." Emma felt the weight of her words sink in, and in that moment she realized that this wasn't just about David anymore. It was about everything she thought she knew, everything she had built her life upon. The world she had known was unraveling before her eyes, and she wasn't sure how much more she could take. She needed answers, but Emma didn't know if she was ready to face any more truths. There was too much pain in this one revelation, too much betrayal in the air. Yet the part of her that still held on to the faint hope that something good might come out of all this demanded one thing: a confrontation. Emma's hands clenched into fists, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. How could Rachel be telling the truth? How could David, the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, have been involved with her sister Laura? After what felt like an eternity, Emma's voice broke the silence. "Where is she? Where is Laura?" Her words were cold, determined. Rachel hesitated for a moment, glancing down at the ground before meeting Emma's eyes. I don't know where she is right now. I didn't plan for you to find out this way, but I think you need to speak to her. It's the only way you'll get the answers you deserve." Emma's breath hitched. She couldn't even imagine what she was going to say to Laura, the woman who had always been there for her, who had been her confidant, her support. But now everything had changed. Without another word, Emma turned on her heel and walked out the door. Her heart was pounding, her thoughts a jumble of disbelief and rage. She needed to find Laura. She needed to confront her. This wasn't something Emma could let go without getting the answers she desperately sought. Emma's drive to Laura's house felt like it took hours. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She kept replaying Rachel's words over and over in her mind. Laura and David? How had this happened? Had she been so blind to the signs, so wrapped up in her own life, that she couldn't see the betrayal happening right under her nose? As she arrived at Laura's house, she parked the car and sat there for a moment, trying to steady her nerves. What was she going to say? How could she look at her sister and not see a stranger, someone who had helped shatter everything Emma held dear? With a deep breath, Emma got out of the car and made her way to the front door. She knocked sharply, her heart hammering in her chest. When the door opened, Laura stood there, her face lighting up with surprise. "Emma, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with confusion. But before Emma could even respond, her eyes fell on the expression on her sister's face. Something wasn't right. Laura looked guilty, her eyes darting away from Emma's. "Can we talk?" Emma asked, her voice dangerously calm. Laura's face paled as she stepped aside, gesturing for Emma to come in. "Of course. Come in, Emma." But Emma didn't move. Instead, she stood there, her eyes locking with Laura's. "I know, Laura. I know everything." The words hung in the air, like a storm waiting to break. And when they did, Emma had no idea how it would change everything, how it would shatter the final piece of her world. Would her sister break down and admit the truth? Or would Emma's worst fear be confirmed? The silence in the room was thick, suffocating. Emma stood at the threshold of Laura's home, her body stiff with tension. Her sister Laura looked at her as though she were a stranger. Her eyes, once full of warmth and familiarity, now seemed distant, almost ashamed. The comfortable, loving relationship they had shared for years felt like a distant memory, one Emma wasn't sure she could ever get back. Emma's heart beat loudly in her ears, and she forced herself to speak, her voice colder than she had ever imagined it would be. "I know, Laura. I know about you and David." For a moment there was a flicker of panic in Laura's eyes, but it quickly faded, replaced by a look of resignation. Laura took a step back, her shoulders slumping, and sighed deeply. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out this way," she whispered, her voice shaky. "But I knew it was only a matter of time before you did." Emma's world spun, her stomach lurching with every word that came out of Laura's mouth. How could she say that? How could she sound so resigned? Didn't she understand the gravity of what she was admitting? Didn't she realize how deeply she had betrayed not just Emma, but the entire family? "You knew!" Emma's voice trembled with disbelief. "You knew what was happening and didn't say anything? You let me live in this lie while you..." She couldn't finish the sentence. It felt like her chest was going to collapse from the weight of her sister's betrayal. Laura avoided Emma's gaze, her face pale, her hands trembling. She seemed to be gathering the strength to speak, but the words seemed to get caught in her throat. Finally, after a long, painful pause, she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "I never meant for it to happen. I didn't plan it, Emma. It just happened. And once it did, I couldn't stop it. I don't know how we got here. It was wrong, so wrong, and I hate myself for it." She paused, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. You were always my best friend, my sister, and I let this happen. I know that's unforgivable." Emma's mind reeled. She had never expected this. Never expected her sister to speak so plainly, to admit to something so horrible. She wanted to scream, to demand answers. But instead, all she could do was stand there, speechless. The person she had trusted most in the world had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And the worst part was that she didn't know if she would ever be able to forgive her. "I don't know how to process this," Emma said softly, the anger that had burned so brightly in her chest now replaced by an overwhelming sense of emptiness. "You were my sister, Laura. I trusted you with everything. And now, this? I don't even know who you are anymore." Laura's face crumpled as she began to cry, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it all back, but I can't. All I can do is beg you to understand that I never wanted to hurt you." Emma stepped back, her eyes filled with tears that she refused to let fall. "You don't get it, do you? You didn't just hurt me. You've destroyed everything. My marriage, my family. And I don't know if I can ever fix this. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again." The words felt like they were tearing her apart, but Emma knew they had to be said. Laura needed to hear it. She needed to understand the full extent of the pain she had caused. And yet, even as Emma spoke, she could feel a small part of her, something deep inside her, aching for the sister she had lost. The person who had once been her closest ally was now a stranger. And the truth was, Emma didn't know how to reconcile that. As the minutes stretched on, Emma and Laura stood in the living room, an ocean of silence between them. Neither of them knew what to say, what to do. The enormity of the situation was pressing in on them, and Emma felt as though she were suffocating. The pain of the betrayal, the confusion over everything that had happened, it was all too much to bear. Emma finally broke the silence, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger, hurt, and disbelief. "How long, Laura? How long has this been going on?" Laura wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, taking a shaky breath. "About 6 months," she admitted softly. "It started after David and I ran into each other at one of the family gatherings. We started talking, and one thing led to another. It wasn't planned. It just happened. 6 months, the time that David had been seeing both her and Rachel. The time Emma had been living in the dark, thinking everything was fine, while her world was crumbling behind her back. The realization hit Emma like a punch to the gut. All this time, while she had been going about her life, believing her marriage was intact, her sister and her husband had been weaving a web of lies. Emma felt her anger flare again, but this time it was directed inward. How had she missed the signs? How had she failed to see the truth before now? It felt as though her whole life had been one big lie, and she had been too blind to see it. 6 months, Emma repeated, her voice low and dangerous. 6 months, and you never thought to tell me. You never thought to tell me that my husband was cheating on me? With you? The words felt like acid on her tongue, but they had to be said. Laura had to know the depth of Emma's hurt. "I was going to tell you," Laura whispered, "but I didn't know how. I didn't know how to explain what had happened, how to face you after all of this. I knew you'd never forgive me. And I was scared, Emma. I was scared of losing you." Emma's eyes narrowed as she stepped closer to her sister. "You should have been scared. You should have thought about that before you slept with my husband, before you betrayed me in the worst way possible." Laura's face crumpled, and she started crying again, her sobs racking her body. "I never wanted to hurt you, Emma. I'm so sorry. I can't take it back, but I wish I could. I swear to you, I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to destroy everything." Emma closed her eyes, feeling tears well up but refusing to let them fall. "I don't know what to do with this, Laura. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can ever trust you again. I can't." The words hung in the air like a final, irreversible blow. Emma didn't know what the future held, whether she would ever be able to rebuild her relationship with her sister or whether this was the end of it all. But one thing was clear. Everything had changed, and Emma didn't know how to move forward from here. The next few days felt like a blur. Emma didn't know how to process what had happened. The conversations with David and Laura kept replaying in her mind. But each time she tried to sort through the chaos, her thoughts became more tangled. She felt like she was drowning in betrayal, and no matter how hard she tried to escape the crushing weight of it, she couldn't breathe. David tried to reach out to her, sending her messages, calling her, but Emma ignored them. There was nothing left to say to him. Not yet. He had destroyed everything. Their marriage, their trust, their future together. How could she even look at him after everything he had done? Laura, too, tried to reach her, sending apologies and pleading with Emma to listen to her side. But Emma couldn't bear to hear it. Her sister had chosen to betray her, and that was something Emma couldn't just forgive with a few tearful words. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the shattered foundation of her entire life. Everything had been built on lies. It was as though a veil had been lifted from Emma's eyes. She saw the truth clearly now, and it was terrifying. Her marriage was over. Her relationship with Laura was broken beyond repair. The people she had trusted most in the world had destroyed everything she had worked so hard to build. And now she was left to pick up the pieces, alone. But in the midst of all this pain, there was a small, flickering flame of something else. Strength. Emma had faced the truth, no matter how ugly it was. She had confronted the lies head-on. And even though it had torn her apart, she knew she had done what was necessary. Now it was time to rebuild. For the first time in a long while, Emma focused on herself. She took long walks to clear her head, spent time with her children, and reconnected with friends who had always been there for her. Slowly, she began to rediscover who she was without the weight of David's lies hanging over her. She wasn't just a wife or a sister. She was Emma, a woman who had been through hell and had come out the other side stronger. As she began the long road to healing, Emma couldn't help but wonder, what had her sister and David really taken from her? They had shattered her life, yes, but they had also given her the chance to see her own strength. And in that, Emma found a small measure of peace. Weeks passed, and the pain of the betrayal slowly started to ebb. It didn't go away completely, but Emma began to realize that healing wasn't a linear process. There were good days and bad days. Days when the weight of everything felt too heavy to carry, and days when she felt like she could stand tall again. She didn't know what the future held, but she had stopped waiting for things to magically fix themselves. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't something that could be rushed. It had to come on her own terms, if it came at all. And right now, the only person she needed to forgive was herself. One afternoon, Emma sat in her garden, the sun warm on her face, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something other than pain. She had found her peace, even if it was still fragile. The path ahead was uncertain, but Emma knew she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. She didn't need David or Laura to validate her anymore. She didn't need their apologies or their explanations. What mattered now was that she had taken control of her own life. She had faced the darkest of truths, and while the scars would remain, they would no longer define her. The road to healing was long, but Emma was ready to take it one step at a time. She had been broken, yes, but she was also learning how to piece herself back together. And maybe, just maybe, that was the greatest victory of all. Months later, Emma sat in the same living room where her world had come crashing down. The house, once filled with laughter and love, was now quiet, save for the sound of her children's footsteps in the hall. Though her life was no longer the picture-perfect reality it had once been, Emma had learned to find strength in the quiet moments, in the moments where she could simply breathe and move forward. David and Laura had both tried to make amends, but Emma had made it clear that she couldn't go back to the way things were. She needed distance. She needed time. Whether or not they could rebuild their relationships, only time would tell. But Emma had come to terms with the fact that some things couldn't be fixed. Some betrayals were too deep to mend. She had started seeing a therapist, began focusing on her career, and slowly began to reclaim parts of herself that she had lost in the chaos. She was learning how to trust again, not others, but herself. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was living her truth. No longer hiding behind the mask of perfection, no longer allowing anyone to dictate her worth. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that was enough. As she stood up and walked toward the window, Emma looked out at the world beyond, uncertain, unpredictable, but full of possibility. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew she was ready for whatever came next. One thing was certain. No matter how dark the days got, Emma would always rise again. The story of betrayal had been one of the hardest chapters of her life. But it wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. And from here, she would write her own future.